Hello everyone, this is Parag. Today we will learn about JavaScript basics in our first tutorial. In today's tutorial, we will see introduction to web applications, client server architecture, what is HTML, CSS and JavaScript and their roles, history of JavaScript and the details, also the advantages of JavaScript. We will also see the differences between Java and JavaScript. So let's start with web application. Web application is a software that runs on web server. So if you see here, so this is the web server. Web server is a machine on which web application is installed. Web server can contain single or multiple web applications as well. So what is the difference between normal application versus web applications? So in our computer, we use different type of applications. For example, we use Notepad, WordPad. So those kinds of applications which we basically use without any internet connections, right? Those applications are native to our computer system. We just download the executable files, we install those files and the application gets installed in our local system. Web applications follows the client server architecture, in which web application that can be a multiple web pages which are hosted on the web server, right? So web application is installed on web server. That web server machine can be anywhere in the world, right? And to access that web application, one client machine is also required. So on client, if you see here, client is a browser, right? So we can access the web application via browser, right? For example, there are multiple type of web application, like online banking websites or e-commerce websites or webmail facility. All those are comes under the web applications. So all the communication between client and server, that happens across the internet. So client sends the request to the web server and web server sends the response to the client, and client, that is browser, interprets that data and presents that data to end user. So that's how the client server architecture works. So this is the detail about the client server architecture. If you see, there is a server machine, right? So server communicates with different types of clients. So client can be any machine which contains the web browser. So that can be an Android mobile phone, Apple iOS mobile phones, our personal computers or laptops, right? So for server side, so any business logic that is implemented in that specific web application needs to be developed with some computer programming language, right? So those languages which are used to develop the server side applications are known as server side programming languages. For example, Java, Python, C Sharp. These languages are commonly known as server side programming languages, which are used to develop the web applications which contains the business logic, right? Similarly, whenever client communicates with the server, right? So there are different languages, for example HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So these languages are known as client side scripting language, and these are used, and they are gets executed on the web browser. So whenever the browser interprets the data and presents to the user, right? So those kind of uh, functionality is built up by the client side programming languages. So HTML, that is hypertext markup language, CSS and JavaScript, these are all client side programming languages. So they are used to interpret the data which is received from the server while accessing the web apps on the browser, right? So this is how they work. So basically all the communication between clients and server happens across the internet via request and responses. Next is, what is the role of HTML, CSS and JavaScript? So all three are the client side scripting languages, right? Now HTML is a hypertext markup language. So basically browser can understand the markup languages. For example, DHTML, XHTML or HTML. These are all the markup languages. So HTML is used to develop the skeleton of web page. For example, whenever we visit any web page, right, on internet, so that web page contains multiple elements like drop down, text input box or any kind of a button, radio buttons. All these web elements are developed by using HTML that creates the skeleton of web page. On top of HTML, we use cascading style sheets to give the look and feel to the website, right? So once we create the skeleton, we need some styling element as well, right? So for that, CSS is used. So CSS is used on top of HTML to give the website better look, better feel. For example, alignment, colors, and the different type of stylish things that is implemented via the CSS. Now once, so basically by using HTML we can create the static web page, right? Now to give the dynamic nature to the website, for example any animation or any specific actions that is dynamic to the web page, for that purpose JavaScript is used. So JavaScript puts the life into the web page and adds the dynamic nature to our web page. So basically JavaScript is embedded within the HTML, right, to give the dynamic nature to our web page. To give the simple example, if you see, if there is a car, right, so first we create the skeleton of the car. That skeleton can be created via HTML language. I'm just giving the example. So if the skeleton of the car is like a HTML language, right, then there is CSS is can be used to give the look and feel. For example, car color, tire colors, on door colors. So every look and feel of that web page is developed via CSS. So in that context, JavaScript can, we can say that, functionality of engine, how tires will work, all these things will comes with the JavaScript. So this is just an example to understand what is the role of different type of scripting languages, that is HTML, CSS and JavaScript, right? So what is JavaScript and its advantages? So JavaScript is a high level interpreted programming language used to make web pages more interactive. Correct. So as we discussed that HTML is used to create the skeleton of web page. Up on top of HTML we use CSS to give look and feel to that web page, and by using JavaScript we can simply put life into our web pages. So JavaScript is interpreted and executed on client machine via web browser. So web browser in if maybe Chrome, Firefox, Mozilla, and all different types of web browser supports the JavaScript language, and they interprets that language and displays the data to the user. It is default scripting language within HTML. Right, to write the JavaScript, we have to first write the HTML, and within HTML that JavaScript gets embedded. JavaScript is a case sensitive language, so we have to be more very careful while with the case sensitivity while programming. So JavaScript is a case sensitive language. It also reduces the load on server. So JavaScript is used to implement different type of client side validations on web pages. So whenever our client communicates with the server, so it communicates via request and responses. So for suppose there are 100 type of requests, right? So if client communicates all the 100 type of requests with server, then it creates sometimes load on the server. So for few type of requests, it is possible to give the client side validation by using JavaScript only. For example, whenever we see forms, there can be implemented, we can implement some client level validation on 10 specific web pages for that, so that it will not send request every time to the server, right? So this type of, so that number of requests can be reduced while using JavaScript is used to manipulate HTML pages as well. So once we create the web page, then JavaScript, using JavaScript we can entirely manipulate the HTML as well. Let's see the JavaScript history now. JavaScript was invented by Brandon H in 1995. So first version of JavaScript was introduced in 1995, and that was became an ECMA standard in from the 1997. Correct. So ECMA script is the official name of the language. ECMA script versions have been abbreviated to ES1, ES2, ES3, ES5, and ES6. From 2015, ECMA script is named by year. For example, ECMA script 2015. Initially, JavaScript was developed for Netscape Navigator. Netscape 2 was the initial browser to run the JavaScript. The latest JavaScript version is 1.8.5, that is identical to ECMA script 5. ECMA script was developed by ECMA International after the organization adopted the JavaScript. So if you see this image, you can easily understand the different type of evolution history of JavaScript. Correct. Now let's see the differences between Java and JavaScript. So Java is a object-oriented programming language. So as we discussed, Java is mainly used to develop the business logic in the web application. So that is mainly used at the server side. Correct. Similarly, JavaScript is client-side scripting language, right? So JavaScript is used to interpret the data on the browser. So it is a object oriented. Both the languages are object oriented, but Java is a programming language, whereas JavaScript is a scripting language. Java runs on the virtual machine, JVM, or browser, right? So Java also has JSP components that can be used to execute Java on the browsers as well. But mainly Java, to run the Java, we need some Java virtual environment, right? But for JavaScript, only browser is enough. So JavaScript runs only on the browser. In Java, code is compiled before execution, whereas in JavaScript, code is interpreted by just-in-time compiler before the execution. Java supports static type checking. So what is static type checking is that we have to specify any data type before using that variables and different things, right? So if I want to assign some value in variable A, that value is 5, that is numeric, so I have to specifically specify that this variable can contain the integer data type, right? But in JavaScript, it supports dynamic type check, so we don't have to explicitly specify the data type here. So if we specify numeric value 5 to the variable A, it will automatically detect that it's integer data type, correct, numeric data type. So that is how JavaScript is supports the dynamic type check. When we create the Java files, we use file extension as .java, while for JavaScript, we can use file extension as .js. To write Java program, it requires entire Java development kit, that is JDK. But to write Java, we need JDK, which contains JVM and different type of tools. But to write JavaScript, we can simply write in any text editor. So it requires only the text editor, and we can execute that on our browsers. So basically, these are some main differences between Java and JavaScript. So that's it for this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we will see about document object model. So thank you for watching, guys. Let's meet you in the next tutorial.